we wanted to make sure that we had time for the rest of the programme, and I'm very happy to say that we have, for the first time in the UK, a member of the Commission Task Force, Stefaan Rynck, who's going to talk to us. So, Stefaan, please.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to UK and a Changing Europe for inviting me. I think it's extremely valuable to have this independent research facility on the EU and the UK. I'm sure you'll have a lot of work for an unforeseeable period to come, let's say. And I was thinking about what President Tusk said when he got the letter of notification when I arrived with the Eurostar last night, and in the taxi takes you in, and you look at the urban landscape of London, and we will miss you, he said. And we know you're not leaving Europe, you're leaving the European Union, but still it is a very important decision. But we are where we are. And I think as a general motto, before I delve a bit into some issues, it's important to note that the UK will become a third country as of the end of March 2019. And that's EU jargon in a way. I'm not sure how that semantically looks from this country to say we are a third country. But in the EU jargon, it means the relationship will be one of a third country. And as Simon said, this event is indeed the first time that we can officially or formally reach out in the UK to discuss the state of play on the negotiations here in the UK and here in London. Now, we don't have the same resources as the UK government has in terms of public engagement. I think it was Christian Lequen who referred this morning to the public engagement strategy that the UK government has with the countries and stakeholders, business community and France was mentioned as an example. We do not have those same resources for the simple reason that our public engagement resources are focused on the future of the EU at 27. And so it's important to keep that in mind in the relationship and in the discussions that for the EU, the future of the Union at 27 is a more important challenge. Nevertheless, the UK's withdrawal is, of course, an important challenge that we need to manage. And I hope that our presence here, modest as it is, will be instrumental also and create the environment or the conditions or be conducive for a public debate that is then conducive to striking a deal in our mutual interest. So I will say a few words on the governance of negotiations, which was Hussein gave to me as a bit of a brief as well, and then in the second part, say a few words on where we are on substantive issues and conclude with a remark on the future. Now, in terms of how the EU has organized itself for these negotiations and what kind of governance structures we have put in place, it's important to remind ourselves of the first period after the referendum, which is the period we refer to as no negotiation without notification. You may remember that. After the referendum, the EU said, yes, please give us soon your letter of notification to the UK, because there is uncertainty. And the first uncertainty certainly was from the member state and from the prime ministers, what happens to my citizens in the UK? What do I do from my duty of care to my own citizens who are in the UK in an uncertain situation? Beyond uncertainty for business, which was also an important issue, but not prioritized as the most important issue. It was right from the EU to take a prudent approach during those 9 months and to stick to the no negotiation, no notification, no negotiation. Because it was the task of the UK government in the first place to decide where the direction of travel was, what the referendum result meant, and how that had to be translated. Indeed, it was also the task of the UK Parliament to eventually do so. Because that was a decision the UK unilaterally took, as Jean-Claude Perry said just before lunch, and so it's the UK's sovereign decision to leave, which needs to be then translated into what it means. And we know now that it means that the UK is leaving the customs union and is leaving the single market. In that first period, there was a lot of talk from the UK government of let's just strike a political deal on the citizens. We know it's your priority, it's also our priority, and that was right. And I think the intention behind that was noble. But it was impossible to strike a political deal on citizens. And it was not very productive to say that we had to do that, because as some people said this morning, and I noted a few, but so many people said it, Eva and Elena, we're a rules-based organization, we're based on law. We're now 5 months into negotiating citizens' rights, and we're not there yet. We need to have precise definitions of law, of enforcement, to guarantee the citizens' rights. So it was impossible to do what the UK government was asking us at that time, to strike a political deal to guarantee, say, the right to stay, which I don't think anyone has ever questioned. Now, that period was also the period where we set up the institutional structures and the ways in which we work. This no notification period gives indeed a few months, and President Juncker appointed Michel Barnier in July, a few weeks after the referendum result. And he subsequently, in December, became the chief negotiator for the European Union. He took office in October. And part of the idea why President Juncker decided to appoint Michel Barnier was that he hoped that the Commission would, by doing so, become the chief negotiator, which is indeed what had happened. That was uncertain at that time. But also, within the Commission, to make sure that the Brexit issue is ring-fenced to a small team of people under the guidance of Michel Barnier, so that the departments of the Commission, the commissioners, the vice presidents of the Commission, can focus on their task, which is the integration of the Union at 27. So it means that Vice President Dombrovskis, while of course he is involved and gives input on the Brexit issue, he works on financial services at 27, the future of the banking union and of the capital markets union. And the Brexit issues are contained, so to say, within the Task Force 50, as we call it, named after the Article 50, under the leadership of Michel Barnier. It's also a way to ring-fence resources, because we are 50-plus people, and that's about it. So, and a large number are involved in logistics and organization of the, or some number at least, of my colleagues. Michel Barnier forged, well, no, that wouldn't be correct to say. The 27 and Michel Barnier, together with the Parliament, forged a unified approach during those months, which is why the European Council was able to adopt its guidelines end of April, a few weeks after the notification letter. Michel Barnier saw all the prime ministers in the first 3-4 months of his mandate to test ideas, to listen to their concerns, to see how they wanted to approach it. And I think I can't stress that enough, how the European Council guidelines, which were adopted in a 5-minute session at the European Council, after which there was a discussion on Brexit more generally, was the result of hard work from the 27 leaders, from their Sherpas, from our team, from the European Parliament, to set down the key principles. And it's a document we read almost every day in our office, because it is really the foundational document for the Brexit negotiations. And it says on the architecture of negotiations that sufficient progress will be declared after phase 1 by the European Council, that there will be no separate negotiations between member states and the UK on Brexit issues, so there will be unified positions, that the chief negotiator is the sole channel of negotiations, and that sequencing is a very important principle to take things in the right order. And I will come back to the guidelines when I talk a bit more on the substantive issues, substantive policy issues. At the same time, and I mentioned the Parliament already, and what Simon referred to this morning, we are working extremely closely also in the run-up to the guidelines, and the Parliament's resolution became a few weeks before the guidelines, more or less saying similar things and similar principles. That we have the Brexit steering group where Michel Barnier reports just before every round of negotiations and after every round of negotiations. And to turn perhaps for a second to how these negotiations work, well, we had 5 rounds so far. We had a first session in June, was basically to say hello and to adopt the terms of reference of how we would work. And we have had 5 rounds since then. From our side, we were ready to have more rounds, and we could have had more rounds. But this is where we are. And we have decided in June to create 3 working groups, one on citizens' rights, where the Home Office is very involved, one on financial settlement, with the Treasury, and one on the other separation issues, which is Euratom, judgments, commercial judgments, automatic recognition questions, all kinds of things. We have a working party as well on governance issues, which is the dispute settlement, and then we have a political dialogue on Ireland. We negotiate this, and here, I think Hussein said this morning, these are not normal trade negotiations. They are not, because the Council is present in each of these meetings. Now, this may sound a bit arcane to you, for those who are not familiar with the institutional workings, but in trade negotiations, the Commission negotiates on behalf of the EU. In this particular negotiations, the Council sits as an observer in the negotiations, so member states are more directly involved in the technical negotiations as well as in the political ones. And I cannot stress enough that sui generis structure. I have never seen the EU work interinstitutionally in the way it works now. And it's hard to have ever seen the EU as united as it has been over the last months. We have a tradition of disuniting ourselves first over issues and uniting in the end. On refugees, on the Eurozone, you name it, there has been lots of divisions between member states over the last 7 years, which have been managed in a way that we can all observe and make our judgment on. But in the Brexit negotiations, it is remarkable that from day one, there was no divergence. And so, to think about this negotiation as a normal negotiation would be wrong. And to think about these negotiations as a normal negotiation where a member state should try to build an alliance against what the Commission is trying to do, which would be the classic way of decision-making, would be wrong. And it's very welcome, I think, that Prime Minister May this morning in Brussels says that it's indeed also in the interest of the UK that the 27 take a unified approach. And so what was referred to this morning as possible divisions, I think that will be counterproductive for us, but also for the negotiations with the UK. Two final words on the governance. We have a transparency policy which is unprecedented. So we publish position papers. We published our first position papers on the citizens' rights and on the financial settlement in May. We transmitted those to the 27 member states. We discussed with the 27 member states in what is called the Council Working Party, which is the heart of technical discussions on Brexit between the Commission's negotiating team and the 27 Brexit delegates of the member states. And so then we transmit that paper to the UK once we have gone through that process of exchanging views with the member states. We hope in the future to be able to publish text proposals on draft agreements, non-papers, but we haven't gotten to that stage yet. I think it's important because the only reassurance also for citizens today is to look at these documents and to look at the agreements that we have found with the UK on the issues. And we have our color-coded table where you see on the citizens' rights what is agreed, what is still outstanding, and so that transparency policy is also an important, it's not just for the public debate, it's also for citizens who have anxieties over Brexit, an important source of reference. Let me conclude this by saying that we have created a space where there is a strong common understanding on Brexit. And some in the UK media especially have mistaken some recent discussions for cracks and internal divisions and the start of the breakdown of the unity, and is Michel Barnier on the same line? I think it would be wrong to mistake discussions on the best approach forward for the next months with cracks in the unity of the 27. It seems to me that some UK media have been led also to that conclusion sometimes. If I can, it's of course their responsibility, but in terms of, it's normal for us to have that space for discussions between the 27. So, on the substantive issues, if I have a bit more time, I'll take a few more minutes. I'll say a word on sequencing in a while, but let me just focus on the three key issues on which we have worked constructively with a problem-solving mentality on both sides, I would say, a problem-solving attitude on both sides so far. And we put clear EU position papers on the table and talked them through with the 27, as I said, and then with the British. And on the British side, we have an extremely professional civil service. Someone referred to this morning to this unfortunate photo that went around where Michel Barnier sat with a stack of papers. I should stress that there was a briefcase under the table on the other side, and there was an iPad in the hands of one of the British assistants, and I think an iPad can contain many more documents than what Michel Barnier had in front of him. So But symbols matter, I guess, and that's just how that went. Where are we on the three key issues? Citizens, financial settlement, and Ireland. On citizens, Prime Minister May's open letter yesterday summed up where we are. So good progress. Why such progress? Because we decided from the beginning to stick to EU law. We said, let's not open a Pandora's box to decide who is covered, what are the material rights we're going to discuss. Let's just take EU law, and we work on that basis. And that's why we could make progress relatively quickly. Nevertheless, the threshold to get to the end of phase one is somewhere there, but it's not ahead of us. Because the foundational stone on enforcement on which all these rights have to be based is not clear at this stage. The Florence speech was very important and very constructive to say the withdrawal agreement will have direct effect. But the actual application and what that exactly means still needs to be clarified. And it's the foundation for everything because we need guarantees that the rights will be sustained over time for the people who have these rights in terms of the future decades, so to say. We still have issues on family reunification, exportability of social security benefits, notably disability benefits, child allowances, and the registration system that was referred to this morning, where the UK is working on a system that will be low cost, easy, and that is very good, but we just need reassurances that how it will work, what happens if someone fills in the form wrongly or is rejected for the wrong reasons, what are the procedural safeguards. We need to have a good discussion on that. On the financial settlement, well, again, the Florence speech is an extremely constructive speech for reaching a deal on the financial settlement. The Prime Minister said no member state should pay more or receive less in 2019-2020. And that means the cash payments 2019-2020 are covered. There are two more issues, what we call the outstanding commitments. What happens with projects committed in 2020 and paid in 21-22, up until the end of 23 maximum. The bills will be on the table in February 2021. Some bills will come later, or some projects still have to start. So we need to discuss that, and we need to discuss the liabilities, contingent liabilities, for instance, loans to Ukraine that the EU has guaranteed. And at this stage, the UK has told us, well, we are not yet in a position to specify what that means. What are those commitments? And we need to get through that in order to start a discussion on the future. On Ireland, just one sentence. I think Bridget covered this very well this morning. The North-South cooperation under the Good Friday Agreement. How does that work once Northern Ireland is under a separate framework and no longer under the EU legal framework? What does taking back control mean for Northern Ireland? For patient mobility between Ireland and Northern Ireland, which today works seamlessly. For waterway management, which works with common environmental standards. For the Peace Programme, which is a cross-border program funded by the structural funds. So all these things still need to be clarified. Clearly, Florence has given the dynamics to that, but there is some more work to be done. A minute on sequencing, if I may, which some people in this country I see describe sometimes as lack of flexibility on the side of the EU. The sequencing is actually the EU principles that we will not compromise on. So if people say, well, the lack of flexibility is because you have to compromise on fundamental principles on what the EU is, then there can be no flexibility. That is very clear. And the sequencing is, Article 50 says withdrawal agreement, once you're a third country, a future relationship agreement. So that puts things in the right order. Uncertainty for citizens needs to be tackled first, but most importantly, I've heard the speaker said this morning, part of the financial settlement should be kept till the end because some of our liabilities need to be used to keep as many benefits as possible of the single market. Well, that will never happen. The obligations are obligations from the past. We first need to settle the obligations from the past before we can discuss the future relationship. How could we discuss a future relationship and a future treaty with a partner that hasn't told us what its obligations are under the current treaty that we have? We need an answer to that question before we can move to the discussion that would lead to a hopefully very ambitious, constructive treaty for the future relationship. But we cannot do that as long as there's uncertainty of how the UK sees its obligations under the current treaties. One final word on the future and disentanglement. In the withdrawal discussions, we have made good progress, but we're also often confronted with our UK friends saying, well, on professional qualifications, we would need such and such, in a way that leads us to believe that the UK wants to keep the single market passport for certain professions. Or when we discuss the goods placed on the market, the discussion moves to what about goods that will be placed on the market? Or what about goods post-Brexit certified by UK regulatory bodies under single market rules, but still post-Brexit? Can those bodies still work under the single market regime? Well, no, they can't. Because when you're outside of the single market, as Jean-Claude Piri said this morning, you're outside of an enforcement structure. You're outside of a common supervision structure. You're outside of a common rule-making structure. So you can have access to that market, but it's very different in terms of economic benefits from participating as a member of that single market. And I think that will be an important challenge that we need to manage together with the UK over the next months to come. I won't say much on the future. I'll just conclude 10 seconds. The European Council, we have now a mandate. The Council has now a mandate with the EU Negotiator to start internal preparatory discussions on possible transition guidelines and on guidelines for the future relationship. So as of next Monday, our work changes a bit in the sense that we now move internally at 27 to a discussion on what a transition could be and what the future relationship could look like. Thank you.
Thank you.